The debris field was the first thing that didn't make sense. Fleet Archivist Sane Voreth had cataloged the remnants of 11 civilizations across her career. She knew what annihilation looked like, the clean geometry of superior firepower, the crystalline scatter patterns of ships that had simply stopped existing. She knew the mathematics of destruction. What she was looking at did not have mathematics. The sensors showed fragments, yes. Wreckage, yes. But the fragments were oriented, not scattered, not dispersed across the expected probability cloud of kinetic destruction. They were arranged, if that word could even apply, in a pattern that made no sense unless the ships had not been destroyed from outside. Unless they had turned around. Unless they had been trying to come back. Sane Voreth pulled her manipulators away from the console and held them motionless in the recycled air of the archive vessel. Behind her, the junior cataloger, a young Velsareth barely 3 molts into his posting, was waiting for her assessment. She didn't give him one. Because the second thing that didn't make sense was worse than the first. The human planet was still there. The hegemony of assembled voices had dispatched 1 million warships to the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star approximately 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days ago. The decision had not been controversial. The hegemony had dispatched comparable fleets before to the Dorathi Collective, to the Singing Worlds of Keth, to the 17 contested systems along the Veth border. In each case, the outcome had been predictable. In each case, a civilization that had refused hegemony integration had eventually, mathematically, ceased to be a problem. The fleet dispatched to the human planet was 3 times larger than anything previously deployed. Not because humanity posed a measurable military threat. The assessment councils had been unanimous on that point. Their fastest vessels barely crossed interstellar distances. Their weapons were chemically propelled. They had not yet unified their entire planetary surface under a single government. The fleet was 3 times larger because the hegemony believed in certainty. 1 million warships was certainty. Sane Voreth had been assigned to document the aftermath, standard archival procedure for newly integrated territories. She had expected to spend 3 cycles cataloging the cultural remnants, the information salvage, the ecological survey data. She had brought 2 junior archivists and a small escort. She had not brought anything capable of defending herself. The human planet glowed blue-white in the forward screens. "Contact the council," she said quietly. "Which council?" the junior cataloger asked. "All of them." The hegemony's first contact with humanity had occurred 6 years before the fleet was dispatched. The records were thorough. Sane Voreth had reviewed them during the transit. A human vessel, barely large enough to qualify as a ship by hegemony standards, had crossed into monitored space near the 7th relay station. The crew consisted of 3 individuals. They had transmitted a greeting in 7 different mathematical formats, which the hegemony's translation matrices had found charming in the way that a child drawing geometric shapes on paper was charming. First contact protocol was initiated. The hegemony was patient. The hegemony was thorough. The assessment began. Within 4 months, the conclusion was reached. Humanity represented a Category 3 emerging civilization, notable for their biological diversity, their surprisingly complex social structures, and their unusual neurological relationship with what their records called *art*, not yet capable of posing any strategic concern, recommended for standard integration offer with a timeline of approximately 40 years. The integration offer was transmitted. Humanity declined. This was not in itself alarming. Category 3 civilizations declined integration offers with some regularity. The hegemony had a protocol for this. A second offer would be transmitted after 12 months. If the second offer was declined, a fleet demonstration would occur, not an attack, simply a demonstration. The mathematics of the situation would then become apparent to the civilization in question, and they would reconsider. The second offer was transmitted. Humanity declined again. And then, this was the part that Sane Voreth had read 3 times during transit, certain she was misunderstanding the translation. Humanity transmitted a response. Not a counteroffer, not a plea, not a capitulation dressed in language designed to preserve dignity. A question. Why do you believe you have the right to make this offer? The Hegemony's Response Council had found this puzzling. Rights, as a concept, were not really applicable to questions of scale. A star does not negotiate with the planets it warms. The Council had transmitted a clarification. The Hegemony was not operating from a concept of rights, but from a concept of inevitability. Humanity's response had taken 11 days, long enough that several council members had assumed the matter resolved. When the response arrived, it was 3 words long. Then we disagree. The perimeter sensors are showing something, the junior cataloger said, his voice carefully controlled in the way that young archivists learned early, a tone that communicated alarm while maintaining professional deniability. There are objects moving at the edge of the debris field. What kind of objects? He paused. They don't match anything in the recognition library, but they're on a course toward us. Sane Voreth crossed the archive deck in 4 strides. The screen showed 7 distinct signatures, moving at a speed that was well within human technological capacity, moving at a speed that suggested they had been watching the archive vessel since it arrived. How long have they been there? I can't determine that. The sensor returns are, he trailed off. Say it. They appear to have been designed to appear on sensors exactly when they wanted to. Sane Voreth looked at the blue-white planet. She looked at the debris field of 1 million warships. She thought about 3 words transmitted across interstellar space. Then we disagree. Don't run, she said. Archivist. If they wanted us destroyed, we would already be destroyed. Don't run. The junior cataloger, his name was Teth, she remembered suddenly, as if the detail had only now become important, said nothing. His manipulators were very still. She had been wrong about something in her initial assessment, and she realized it only now, staring at the approach vectors of the 7 human vessels. She had assumed the fleet had been destroyed here, at this location. She had assumed the debris was the endpoint. It was not. The debris was the *return point. The fleet had entered the Sol system 4 years ago. The engagement, if it could be called that, had lasted not hours, not days. The Hegemony's last coherent communications from the fleet commanders had continued for 3 months. She had access to those records now, because that was what archivists carried, records. She had not prioritized reading them during transit because she had expected the situation to be comprehensible upon arrival. She began reading them now. The first dispatches from the fleet were routine, arrival confirmation, initial scans. The human planet's defenses were, as predicted, primitive by every measurable standard. No shielding systems of note, no capital ships, no coherent military response at the scale required to threaten even a fraction of a 1,000,000-ship fleet. The fleet commanders had sent their initial demand for surrender with something that Sane Voreth recognized as institutional boredom. Humanity had not surrendered. Humanity had, instead, done something the fleet commanders' dispatches spent considerable length trying to describe accurately. The word they kept returning to, across different commanders and different timeframes, was a translation approximation. Swarmed. Not with warships, not with weapons platforms or defense grids, and here the translation matrices genuinely struggled with everything. Every vessel that could be pressurized and propelled, mining platforms, commercial transports, vessels not designed for combat in any recognizable sense. Vessels crewed by people who, by the Hegemony's own assessment data, knew they were going to die and went anyway. Archivist Teth's voice was very quiet. "They're hailing us." The voice that came through the communication system was female, by human biological categorization, and spoke in clean hegemony standard, which meant she had either studied it specifically or had access to translation technology that the hegemony had not believed humanity possessed 4 years ago. Archive Vessel, I'm Commander Yara Osai, Consolidated Human Defense Force. I understand you're here to document what happened. I'd like to help you with that. Sane Voreth found her voice. Commander Osai, we are an unarmed archive vessel. We represent no military function. I know what you are, Osai said. I've been watching you since you arrived. I watched you figure out the debris field wasn't what you expected. You're smart, you stopped before you made assumptions. A pause. That puts you ahead of your fleet commanders. You monitored our internal assessment. We monitored your sensor sweeps. You looked at the debris for 19 minutes before you told your junior to contact all the councils. Most people would have had a theory by minute 3. Another pause, and something in the human's voice shifted, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. I'd like to meet with you, on the station, if you're willing. Sane Voreth looked at Teth. Teth looked at her. What station? She asked. Commander Osai said, the one we built. And on the forward screen, something that had been reading as debris for the past hour resolved, suddenly, into a structure. Enormous. Operational. Positioned at the gravitational center of the debris field like a spine through the wreckage of 1,000,000 ships. Built from them. The misinterpretation had begun. Sane Voreth realized aboard the docking shuttle, in the very first month of the engagement. She was reading the fleet commander's dispatches with new comprehension now, her understanding revised by every kilometer they traveled toward the station. The commanders had watched the initial human response, the swarm of commercial and mining vessels, and had drawn a logical conclusion. Humanity was expending its entire non-military infrastructure in a single desperate gesture. A civilization throwing everything it had at an enemy it could not defeat, burning its own capacity for future resistance in one final act of defiance. The fleet commanders had let them come, had documented the losses with something approaching pity. Tens of thousands of human vessels destroyed in the initial engagement, crewed by people who, by every rational metric, should not have been there. The commanders had transmitted their assessment back to the hegemony. Initial resistance phase complete. Civilian infrastructure of target civilization reduced by an estimated 40%. Military resistance remains negligible. Integration timeline, 60 days. What the fleet commanders did not understand, what the hegemony's entire assessment model did not have a category for, was that the human vessels were not the attack. They were the asterisk measurement asterisk. Every vessel that engaged the fleet's edge, every miner, every freighter, every pressurized platform crewed by people who sent messages home before they went was learning something. Weapons frequencies, shield harmonics, response patterns, firing solutions, how long a hegemony capital ship took to redirect its guns, where the sensor gaps were, which ship classes communicated with which and along what pathways. 40,000 human vessels died in the first month, and every death taught the survivors something that a supercomputer could not have calculated from a distance, because the hegemony's fleet configurations were too well encrypted to crack without physical proximity, and the only way to get physical proximity to 1,000,000 warships was to go be close to 1,000,000 warships and accept what that meant. Sane Voreth set down the dispatch reader. Her shuttle had entered the docking bay of the station. The station that had been built from hegemony warships. The station that was, she now understood, far larger than it appeared from the outside, because most of it was asterisk inside the debris field, threaded through it, using the wreckage as both material and camouflage. This had not been improvised, this had been planned. Which meant the humans had planned this before the fleet arrived. which meant they had known the fleet was coming, and built their defense strategy around the assumption that they would lose the first engagement badly and need a platform built from the enemy's own materials to continue. The shuttle settled, the docking clamps engaged. Teth said very quietly, "They plan to lose 40,000 ships." "No," Sainvorath said, "they plan to lose more than that, and they came anyway." Commander Yara Osai was smaller than Sainvorath had expected, which was an irrational observation, and she recognized it as such. Humans varied enormously in physical dimension. The assessment files were full of that data. But Os moved in a way that made the space around her feel larger, not smaller. She met them at the docking bay threshold without a military escort, which was either a gesture of trust or a demonstration that she didn't need one, and Sainvorath genuinely could not determine which. "You read the dispatches on the way over," Osai said, "not a question." "How did you know?" Your expression changed. Os tilted her head. "You understood something. I've seen that look before. We call it the moment someone realizes the war they thought they were watching wasn't the war that was actually happening." She turned and walked. They followed. "How many of your people died?" Sainvorath asked. Os didn't stop walking. "In the first month, about 300,000, military and civilian personnel who volunteered for proximity missions. A beat. In the full 4 years, more than that." "More than—" "I'll show you the memorial," Osai said. "But first I need you to understand something before I show it to you, because if I show it to you before you understand, your reaction will be the wrong one." They passed through a corridor built unmistakably from the hull plating of a hegemony fleet carrier. The welds were visible. The work had been done quickly, but it had been done with extraordinary care, which was itself something. "What must I understand first?" Sainvorath asked. "Why they didn't stop," Osai said. "After the first month. After the first 3 months. After the hegemony fleet destroyed 6 of our major orbital stations and we lost contact with 40% of our coordination network, and the fleet commanders sent their 60-day integration estimate back to your council." She paused at a viewport. Outside, the debris field spread across kilometers in every direction. "We held a vote." Sainvorath stopped. "A vote. A planetary vote, not a government decision, not a military decision. A vote. Every human on Earth who was alive and capable of communicating a decision was given a choice." Osai looked at the debris field. "Continue or negotiate." "And the result?" Osai smiled, but it was the wrong kind of smile. The kind that carried weight instead of releasing it. 81% voted to continue, she said, including most of the families of people who had already died. The second great misinterpretation had occurred in month 4. Sainvorath read it that evening. In the quarters Osa had provided real quarters, not a cell, with a real viewport and a data terminal loaded with files she had clearly been expected to receive. The hegemony fleet commanders had observed something unusual in month 4. The human resistance had become less coherent. Attacks that had previously shown clear coordination began to fragment. Different human vessels were using different frequencies, different approaches, seemingly contradicting each other. The commanders had analyzed this pattern and concluded, logically, by any measure, that the human command structure was collapsing, that the months of sustained loss were fracturing their organizational capacity. The fleet had been repositioned accordingly, concentrating force at what appeared to be the human command nodes, expecting the military structure to buckle. What the commanders had not understood was that the apparent incoherence was intentional. The human command structure had not fragmented. It had decentralized, distributed decision-making authority to individual ship captains and cell commanders across the entire engagement zone, removing the central nodes that the hegemony's fleet was repositioning to destroy. Every time the fleet concentrated force at what it believed was a command hub, that hub had already been abandoned. The humans had watched the hegemony's own tactical response patterns, learned during the first month, and were feeding the fleet information it was predisposed to believe. And while the fleet was repositioning, the actual coordination was happening, not through the frequency bands the hegemony was monitoring. Through something the commander's dispatches spent 4 increasingly frustrated pages trying to describe. Human ships were maneuvering into proximity with each other and exchanging physical packages, objects, hard copy, information that could not be intercepted because it was not transmitted. The fleet commanders had assumed this was primitive. They had been correct. It was also undetectable, which made it the most sophisticated communication system in the engagement. Sane Voreth set down the terminal. She looked at the viewport. The debris was beautiful in a way she had not expected, the metal catching starlight at angles that created an accidental geometry. She thought about 81% of a species voting to continue dying. She thought about what that number meant for the other 19%. She had assumed the 19% were the sane ones, the rational ones, the ones whose position was vindicated by any logic she could apply. And perhaps they were. But they had participated in the vote, which meant they had accepted the result, which meant even the people who had voted to stop had continued to function within a system that chose not to stop. A soft chime from the terminal. A new file had been added, no sender identification, just a title. Month 7, the decision you haven't asked about yet. She opened it. Month 7 was when the hegemony fleet had first attempted to use the thing it had not used yet because it had not needed to. The commanders had, in their professional assessment, been patient, had given the humans ample opportunity to recognize the mathematics. The thing was called, in hegemony military classification, a stellar compression event initiator. It was not a weapon, technically, because the hegemony's charter prohibited weapons capable of sterilizing planetary surfaces. It was an asterisk device asterisk. A device that could induce a temporary destabilization event in a yellow star's fusion dynamics, producing a pulse of radiation that would render a planet's biosphere non-viable for approximately 3 generations of the target species. Technically distinct from sterilization, the hegemony's legal scholars had reviewed this thoroughly. The fleet commanders had activated the device. The pulse had not fired. The pulse had asterisk not fired. The commander's dispatches entered a register that Sane Voreth had never encountered in 30 years of archival work. Something close to professional hysteria, carefully worded, institutional in structure but hysteria nonetheless. The device was responding normally to all diagnostic inputs. All systems showed operational. The firing solution was confirmed. The pulse would not fire. The device had been modified. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Modified, specifically, in a way that allowed it to appear fully operational while being incapable of firing. The modification required access to the device's internal architecture, which required either hegemony engineering knowledge that humanity did not possess, or a period of physical access to the device itself, or the commanders had checked their docking logs. They had checked the access records for every vessel that had come within 3 kilometers of the device's housing carrier. One of the suicide swarm vessels from month 1 had impacted against the housing carrier. It had been logged as a failed ramming attack. The hull damage had been repaired within hours. The impacting vessel had carried 7 people. None of them had survived the impact. But the impact had been angled. Specifically angled. The vessel had not been trying to destroy the carrier. It had been trying to open a specific access panel on the carrier's exterior long enough for 3 crew members in hardened pressure suits, moving in the debris created by the impact, to enter the carrier's maintenance crawl spaces. They had survived inside the carrier for 11 days. 3 of them had been found and killed on day 4. The remaining 2, the dispatches contained their names, recovered from human records captured later. Specialist Deo Adwale and engineer Priya Nair had reached the device's housing on day 9, had spent 40 hours modifying it, had been detected leaving on day 11 and had not survived. Priya Nair had been 26 years old. Deo Adwale had been 31. They had known when they entered the carrier that they would not leave. Sain Voreth sat for a long time with the file open and unchanged on the terminal. In the morning, station morning, marked by a lighting shift that the humans had implemented even in a space installation, Osai took her to the memorial. It was a wall. That was the closest description. A wall that curved slowly, following the interior architecture of the station's largest open chamber, and it was covered entirely with human script in a density that made Sain Voreth's primary optical organs struggle to focus. Names. Nothing but names. Starting from the top of the curve and descending not alphabetically, not by rank, but by date. The order of dying. "How long is it?" Sain Voreth asked. 4 kilometers, Osai said. "How many names?" Osai was quiet for a moment. "Final count isn't complete yet. We're still identifying some of the proximity mission crews." She paused. "Current confirmed total is 2.2 million. The number entered Sain Voreth's mind and simply sat there, too large to process as an abstraction. She had cataloged 11 civilizations. The largest single event loss she had ever processed in an archival context was 400,000, a species that had suffered a catastrophic failure of their primary agricultural system. 2.2 million people who had voted, or whose representatives had voted, to continue. "I need to ask you something," Sain Voreth said. "Go ahead." "The fleet, 1 million ships, they're not all here." She had calculated it during transit. The debris field accounted for approximately 60% of the dispatched fleet by mass. "Where are the rest?" Something shifted in Osai's face. Not discomfort, something more controlled than discomfort. "Come with me," she said. The third great misinterpretation was, in retrospect, the most important one. The hegemony fleet, what remained of it after 3 years of engagement, had attempted to withdraw in month 37. Not in defeat. The hegemony did not process things through the category of defeat. In repositioning asterisk. The resistance had proven more costly than calculated. The device had been compromised, and the strategic assessment required revision. A withdrawal, resupply, and renewed approach was the rational response. The remaining fleet, approximately 380,000 ships, had begun their exit vector. They had not completed it. The screen in the station's strategic analysis room showed Sain Voreth what had happened, and she watched it with the particular stillness of a person who understood that what they were seeing was not a display of human capability. It was a display of human planning across a 4-year timeline. The withdrawal route had been seeded. Not with mines could be detected and cleared. With something else. With a network of signature-masked platforms that the human proximity missions had positioned over 3 years along every probable withdrawal vector. Not weapons platforms. Communication relay nodes, military classification, capable of projecting localized electromagnetic interference fields that disrupted hegemony fleet communication synchronization. A hegemony fleet of 380,000 ships required constant synchronized communication to operate as a fleet. Without it, they were 380,000 individual ships with individual captains making individual decisions. The disruption had lasted 6 hours. 6 hours was enough. The remaining human military, which had been, by design, kept in reserve while civilians and volunteers bore the cost of the first 3 years, engaged a fragmented fleet of 380,000 individual ships that could not coordinate. "You kept your military back," Sain Voreth said. Her voice sounded strange to her. "For 3 years, while civilians died, you kept your actual military capacity in reserve." We kept about 30% in reserve, Osai said. We needed the hegemony to believe we were expending everything we had. If they'd seen organized military reserves, they would have prioritized destroying them. So we prioritized everything else first. She looked at the screen. The volunteers knew the reserve existed. Every proximity mission crew knew. They weren't dying so their government could survive. They were dying so the reserve could stay hidden long enough to matter. They chose that. Every one of them, Osai said. The vote covered that specifically. People were told about the reserve before they voted. They knew their deaths were partly intended to obscure a military capacity. A pause. 81% said yes anyway. The number meant something different now than it had the day before. Where are the remaining ships? Sainvorath asked again. Osai pulled up a different display. Coordinates, dozens of them. After the 6-hour fragmentation engagement, she said, approximately 140,000 hegemony ships survived and successfully withdrew from the Sol system. She gestured at the coordinates. We tracked them, all of them. They dispersed to 14 different hegemony systems. She paused. We sent people to each one. Sainvorath stared at the coordinates, at the distances they represented. You don't have faster-than-light capability, she said. We didn't have documented faster-than-light capability, Osei said. We've been working on it since first contact. We had 6 years. She said it without pride, which was somehow worse than pride would have been. It's not efficient. It's not safe. The failure rate is about 1 in 9 transits. We sent volunteer crews to 14 hegemony systems. To carry a message, Osei said. Not a weapon, a message. What message? Osei looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that evaluated something. The same message we sent your council 6 years ago, she finally said. Before any of this, before the fleet came, we just made sure this time that it would be harder to dismiss. Then we disagree. The full accounting came to Sainvorath in pieces over the next 3 days, and each piece was worse than the last, in the specific way that the word worse applied to things that forced complete revision rather than things that caused harm. The 140,000 surviving hegemony ships had returned to their home systems carrying damage and data and after-action reports. They had distributed across 14 systems. Human vessels, crewed by volunteers whose survival probability for the transit alone had been approximately 89% per leg, had followed them to each system and established presence. Not aggressive presence, visible asterisk presence. Had transmitted on open frequencies a complete record of the 4-year engagement, every fleet commander's dispatch, every tactical decision, the device modification, the memorial wall's full name catalog, and then had asked, on open frequencies, whether the populations of those 14 systems wished to continue being administered by a hegemony that had spent 4 years and 1 million warships attempting to sterilize a planet by legal technicality. The responses, Osei told her, were still coming in. You're not trying to defeat the hegemony, Sainvorath said. It was not a question. She had been working toward this understanding for 3 days and had finally arrived. You're not trying to destroy it or replace it or conquer anything. No, Osei said. You're making an argument, Sainvorath said. Everything, the 4 years, the 2.2 million people, the reserve fleet, the volunteers in enemy ship maintenance crawlspaces, all of it was evidence for an argument. The same argument we made 6 years ago, Osei said. Your council didn't engage with it then. We needed them to have a reason to engage with it now. Sainvorath looked at the wall of names, at 4 kilometers of names in order of dying. Why send me an archivist? She asked. The council sent me here to document a territory they believed had been integrated. Why tell me all of this? Why show me the strategic records, the device modification files, Because you're the one going back, Osei said. The council doesn't know any of what you know now. They dispatched you expecting a standard archival assignment. You'll return with something they're not prepared for." She paused. "We need whoever receives your report to understand something before they make the next decision." "And what is that?" Os looked out the viewport at the debris field that had been 1 million warships, at the station built from their hulls, at the blue-white planet behind it that had refused twice, and then spent 4 years proving why refusing was the right answer, at the names of 2.2 million people who had chosen math that should have been impossible and made it possible anyway. "That we are not asking them not to be afraid of us," Osei said. "We're asking them to understand that we had this conversation 6 years ago and what happened after they didn't listen, and that the humans aboard those 14 relay ships in hegemony space, the ones with 1 failure rates, are not soldiers." She turned. "They're diplomats, and if the hegemony's next response is another fleet, we'll build another station, and we'll send more diplomats, and we'll add more names to that wall. And we will keep doing that." A pause. "Until someone in your government decides to sit down and have the conversation we asked for before any of them died." Sane Vorath's report to the Council of the Hegemony of Assembled Voices was 340,000 words long. It took 11 days to transmit and was flagged, upon receipt, as a potential forgery. The Council had assumed she would send documentation of an integrated territory. Instead, they received 4 years of their own fleet commander's dispatches, annotated and cross-referenced with human tactical records in a way that demonstrated, in precise mathematical terms, that every hegemony assessment of human capability had been based on what humans allowed the assessors to measure. The report contained a full analysis of the stellar compression event initiator modification. The forensic engineering was detailed enough to be humiliating. 2 humans in maintenance crawlspaces, over 40 hours, had permanently disabled the most significant weapon in the hegemony's arsenal in a way that left it appearing functional until it was needed. The modification had been performed with tools they had brought with them. The tools had been built specifically for this purpose. The tools had been built before the fleet arrived, which meant the humans had known the device would be deployed, which meant they had analyzed hegemony doctrine thoroughly enough to predict a weapon that had never been used against a Category 3 civilization before. The report contained Osei's message, verbatim. It contained the name count from the memorial wall, current as of Sane Vorath's departure, 2,247,891 confirmed. Estimated final count, higher. It contained, at the very end, a single observation that Sane Vorath had written herself, not as an archivist but as a person who had spent 3 days in the presence of something she had not previously had a category for. In 30 years of cataloging the remnants of civilizations that did not survive contact with the hegemony, I developed an understanding of what resistance looks like at its terminus. Resistance ends when a species calculates that the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of stopping. Every civilization I have documented made this calculation correctly. They stopped when stopping was rational. They accepted integration when acceptance was mathematically indicated. Humanity did not make this calculation incorrectly. They made a different calculation entirely. They calculated how much it would cost to continue, arrived at a number that would have terminated any other resistance in our records, and then held a vote about whether the argument was worth the cost. 81% decided it was. I have reviewed the argument. It is 3 words long. It has not changed since they first transmitted it 6 years ago. I do not know how to advise the Council. I know only this. The humans aboard those 14 vessels in our space are waiting for a conversation. They have demonstrated what they are willing to pay to have it. The question the Council must answer is not whether we can defeat them. The question is how many names we are willing to add to a 4-kilometer wall before we sit down. They are not the strongest species I have encountered. They are the only species I have encountered that decided strength was the wrong variable. The Council debated Sane Vorath's report for 9 days. On the 10th day, they transmitted a response to the human vessels in their space. The response was not a fleet. It was a question. What terms would you consider acceptable for the beginning of a conversation? Humanity's response arrived 11 days later, accounting for transit time. It was not a list of demands. It was not a territorial claim. It was not a strategic document. It was exactly what OS had said it would be. The same thing they had been trying to say since the beginning, offered again without condition, without anger, without any reference to 2.2 million names on a wall that still wasn't finished, because they were still counting, because they had agreed to keep counting until every name was known. The response was 4 words. The one extra word was, perhaps, the most devastating thing in the transmission. Then we can talk. Somewhere in a station built from the wreckage of 1 million warships. In a chamber with a memorial wall 4 kilometers long, in front of a viewport showing a debris field that every rational calculation said should have been a planet's grave. Commander Yara Osei read the hegemony's question on a screen and put it down without expression, and looked at the stars for a long time. Then she began drafting a reply. Outside, the debris field caught the light of the yellow star and held it, turning slowly, all that wreckage of certainty orbiting a planet that had declined to be certain about anything except the conversation it wanted to have, the conversation that had always been available, the conversation that was now, finally, 4 years and 2.2 million names later, about to begin. The wall was still being built. The names were still being added. No one had suggested they should stop.